Welcome everybody to our Why Hybrids Matter panel discussion. With an ever-moving automotive landscape and a broad range of choices, many people are unsure of which direction to go in with regard to their next vehicle. And for years, there's been a strong focus on the global development and rollout of electric vehicles, and this is going to continue to be a big focus, no doubt. But in the last year, several governments and car manufacturers have started to talk more and more about hybrids and their role in the vehicle park, not just as a transitional technology to EVs as first anticipated, but also having a longer term role and benefit. So we've brought together a panel of experts to discuss how hybrid vehicles fit into this ever-changing world and how different geographies and car manufacturers are focusing on different types of hybrid. So let's start off by meeting the panel members, and I'll go to Mike first. Welcome, Mike. If you could give a quick introduction.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm Mike Bassett. I'm Engineering Director at Powertrain in the UK. We focus on designing propulsion systems for our automotive customers, internal combustion engines, hybrid drivelines. We've been working on hybrid systems for over 15 years and developed a number of prototype and demonstrator vehicles along the way.
Great, Mike, thanks for joining. And Thomas, over to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Thomas Lüdiger. I have two roles at the FEV Group. First, I'm a principal at FEV Consulting, and also I have the role of head of Powertrain strategies for the FEV Group. I joined FEV in 2012, so now 12 years of management consulting, mainly in the area of e-mobility, combining strategic consulting with the deep technical expertise of the FEV Group. And typically my projects range from market trend analyses and powertrain forecasts all the way to defining future product portfolios, powertrain and vehicle concepts, as well as business strategies for OEMs and suppliers.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, Thomas. And then over to Colin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Colin McCarricker. I run a group called the Clean Transport Analyst Group at Bloomberg NEF. We're a data and analysis provider, and we work with pretty much all the major automakers, parts suppliers, battery manufacturers, oil and gas companies, governments, and financiers on their strategy for a low carbon world. And that includes everything around electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, charging infrastructure, and all the related pieces of the ecosystem around that.
And finally, I'll introduce myself. My name's Chris Lockett, and I'm the SVP for Electrification and Castrol Products and Technology. So the R&D that sits behind all of Castrol's products, and also BP Pulse and Electrification for BP. I'd be really interested to get your thoughts on where you think we are now in terms of the different types of hybrids, be it mild, full, plug-in, REEVs, and EVs adoptions around the world. What does it look like now in terms of the different levels of adoption that you're seeing?
I can give the really high-level view if that helps. So right now, and I'm sure others have can chime in there too. We're seeing about 14% of global vehicle sales right now are battery electric. So that's full electric. Around 6 or 7% are plug-in hybrid. A little fewer than half of those are EREV plug-in hybrids. So what we just talked about. Strong hybrid, about 7%, and then all the rest combined about 73%. So that includes internal combustion engines with no hybridization, plus the mild hybrids that were discussed. Maybe someone else wants to give the further breakdown of mild hybrids. There's just no electrification at all, but that's the rough cut from the top level anyway.
We look at the different opinions, there's different regulations, there's different legislations around the world. What trends are you all seeing? What changes are you seeing? And what challenges or opportunities do you think this brings?
I mean, from my perspective, and you're already pulling up those charts, I think it's really different among the key automotive regions. So the key drivers are different in Europe, US, and in China. I think if we start looking into Europe, definitely a big driver of any kind of powertrain decision and electrification is the CO2 targets for the different OEMs. And obviously, they are pushing electrification quite a bit, particularly the role of battery electric vehicles, but adoption of BEVs are lower than anticipated. So OEMs are struggling to reach CO2 targets with a limited market share of battery electric vehicles. So what we see is that hybrids are being pushed a bit more recently by OEMs, and this is increasing the share of mild hybrids on, let's say, the lower spec and cheaper vehicles. So at least going from an ICE only to an MF to have a couple of percentage points less CO2 emitted. And then on the other hand, basically a revival of plug-in hybrid vehicle sales and another push of OEMs to sell those in Europe. Yeah, I think in 2021, plug-in hybrid sales were even higher than currently, but we expect that to grow again, not only by traditional plug-in hybrids, but for example, those REEVs we were talking about might also be introduced in Europe. But we do not expect so much uptake of full hybrids, rather an increase of plug-in hybrids and REEV and mild hybrids. And then for Europe, the key question will be whether the CO2 regulation stays more or less the way it is right now, which would effectively ban combustion engines in 2035 and after. As you can see here, we already have kind of a moderate scenario which we communicate to our customers, in which we would believe that there is a slight adaptation of the CO2 regulation, not a complete turnaround, but an adaptation which would allow to sell still combustion engine based vehicles, but probably in a form of strong hybridization. So again, plug-in hybrids, REEVs, that might be allowed also to be sold after 2035. So for US, things look a bit different, obviously, now, particularly after Trump has been elected compared to Europe. Particularly, we don't see as much battery electric vehicles, as a lot of US customers are still skeptic regarding battery electric vehicles. And if you look at use cases compared to Europe, longer distance driving, heavier vehicles, and also insufficient charging infrastructure in many areas of the US, which leads to the fact that we do not believe battery electric vehicles to increase as steeply as in Europe. And therefore, there's obviously more room for hybrids. And if you look at what OEMs have been recently announcing, the big three from the US, but also Asian OEMs and some EU OEMs for the US market, then you see that there is an increased shift towards hybrids, mainly talking about plug-in hybrids, but also REEVs. So concepts we see today more in China, also to be introduced onto the US market, and not just from Chinese OEMs, but also so-called legacy OEMs from Japan, Korea, the US, and also European OEMs. And then obviously, besides those federal level regulations in the US, we have California, the CARB, which has quite some relevant regulations as well in terms of which push electrification in those states. And I think an interesting aspect is that the CARB requires in California and those states who follow the regulation also 100% of new vehicles sold to be zero emission. You can also, the reason why I'm just putting this into parentheses is that in fact, those 100% ZEV target, that 100% ZEV target in 2035 allows OEMs to still sell 20% of PHEVs to be accounted as so-called zero-emission vehicles, as long as they have a range, an all-electric range of 50 miles and above. So from this, you can also see that even in California, there is a long-term relevance of PHEVs and particularly REEVs, because they offer long electric ranges and might be sold even in California after 2025.
Yeah, okay, that's great. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because you look at the different types of regulation and legislation that's been adopted in different countries in the world. It's all quite, it's slightly different in different places, and it's interesting to see how that plays out. So in China, for example, there isn't a so-called internal combustion engine ban, but their penetrations of new electric vehicles, both hybrids and battery electric vehicles, is higher than anywhere else in the world. Yet in Europe, where there is such a target, uptake seems to have plateaued, and therefore hybridization is coming back into the mix. What are people's views in terms of the legislation, regulation versus, people making choices because of the type of use of vehicles that they're looking to use in their everyday lives?
Can I just comment on something? I mean, part of the reason you see this plateau in both plug-in hybrids and battery electrics in Europe is simply because automakers know that the regulations tighten in 2025. So why would they sell more of those in 2024 when they're already compliant? So most of them have timed their product launches for the vehicles that will help them reduce their CO2 footprint for 2025. So you see a number of them that are planning around that. So I think that plateau, we saw that in 2019 as well, ahead of the tightening in 2020. That plateau is very much expected and would be part of normal behavior from the automaker side as they strategize the best timelines to release their vehicles on. The other thing I would just say, I think the fuel economy regulations are the biggest, are a huge driver. The other thing that sets how much electrification you get, because that's the question we're talking about, is how far down the electrification pathway do you go, is the underlying cost of the technology and the underlying cost of lithium-ion batteries, right? So our company's been gathering a lot of data on lithium-ion battery prices, and it showed a 20% drop, with battery prices falling below $100 per kilowatt hour for the first time for all of 2024 globally for battery electric vehicles. I think the interesting thing there is that China, you're already at about $79 per kilowatt hour at the pack level for batteries. So I think the question of how many batteries do you get, and it is a function of how much batteries cost. So the reason automakers haven't put bigger battery packs in before is because they cost a lot. And if they start costing a lot less, people will put bigger and bigger batteries in. And then there's a question of, do you pull the plug or not? Or sorry, do you keep the engine or not? Is a better way to put it. And I think that will also be affected by the price of the battery. So if batteries are so cheap that you can add really, really large ranges, you will get much higher levels of electrification, pushing up into those EREVs and full BEVs. And I think the policy has been the catalyst. But what you see in markets like China is the policy was the catalyst, and then consumer adoption for EREVs and for BEVs just kind of took over and is now running ahead of where any government targets were aiming for. So I think there's this policy piece, there's this consumer behavior piece, and then there's this how far do we get down the cost curve on the underlying technology that will determine the size of battery packs that are going into cars and whether they still have a backup engine or not.
Yeah, no, great points. I think, you got that kind of triangle of factors that the people are trying to navigate, and I think they all play a vital part. I think you're right.
The battery prices itself, and then are lower already in China compared to other markets, and then this obviously also translates into vehicle prices. And I think that's the big difference between China and Europe. In China, there is a lot of offerings on cheap and entry-level BEVs, which is lacking in both Europe and US. And then, so this already helps the adoption. And another element which increases the pull from the customer side in China compared to Europe, for example, is the fact that electricity is really cheap in China compared to the gasoline price.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the market's been skewed by taxation and policy. I think you're right about uptake in China and the levy on new vehicles and registration costs for new ICE vehicles, particularly in the large cities. I think in the UK, benefit in kind tax to company car users is something that's skewed the market somewhat. And I think it's also something that's led to perhaps plug-in hybrids having a poor reputation in that they were foisted upon company car users who were perhaps incentivized not to plug them in because they also got company fuel, but weren't reimbursed for any electricity they used. So, you're given a car that you can drive on gasoline for free, or it costs you money to plug in. And I think some of the studies around the utilization of plug-in hybrids have perhaps been unfair because of the demographic of the people who have adopted them early. And I think the other factors are the range, and early ones, because of the tailpipe weighting curves, actually it made financial sense for manufacturers to have a small battery that gave the purchaser the tax benefits. But actually, when you look at the whole sort of life cycle equation and how much fuel you can displace over the life cycle of the plug-in hybrid, a driving range of probably 70 to 100 kilometers makes much more sense, because it enables most daily driving to be done purely electrically, and also incentivizes the user to plug in. I think if you've only got a 15-mile electric range and you come home with a load of shopping and it's raining, do you really bother plugging in? And I think some of those factors we'll see improving the uptake of plug-in hybrids in future as the utility factors get better.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think something we've been tracking is just that the first generation of plug-in hybrids were primarily compliance because they were treated very well under CO2 regulations, fuel economy regulations in different places. The next generation of them is actually aimed at real buyers using them, and it is being led out of China, but it's being picked up elsewhere too. So we track the average range of plug-in hybrids sold around the world, and in China, it's being pulled up significantly, up to around 90 kilometers of the average plug-in hybrid range, because there's this mix of revs and e-revs that we talked about. So far in North America and Europe, it's still flat. They're still less capable, but I think the next ones that'll launch there, based on watching what's happening in the Chinese market, will have those longer ranges, and you will see the percentage of time done or percentage of kilometers done in electric mode start to rise in those places as well. As was said, it's a bit abysmal for company cars. Private cars, we did a bit of meta-analysis on all the different studies done, find generally between 25 and 50% of total kilometers traveled on electric mode in PHEVs for private owners, not company car owners. And it actually skews towards the higher end of that with the bigger studies that have been done more recently. So some reason for optimism there. I agree that the higher capable plug-in hybrids will lead to higher utilization in electric mode, better results from both an emissions and potentially money-saving point of view for consumers.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I think that's where plug-in hybrids start to get kind of really interesting as a consumer proposition, right? Is once you start to get to 50, 60, 70, 80 miles on EV charge, then for a lot of people, that means that they can drive full electric for, 80, 90% of their journeys. And then when they need to go a bit further, that's when they switch over to the ICE engine. Whereas, as you say, the first generation, when they were kind of 20 or 30 miles, it was fairly limited, and ICE was kind of the primary use because people weren't charging all the time to kind of keep it topped up for those smaller ranges. What strategies are you seeing with the car manufacturers to kind of overcome some of these challenges and making decisions on whether should it be a plug-in hybrid, and if plug-in hybrid, what range versus range extenders, which particularly in China seems to be quite a kind of growing market. Even with the pure EV companies, they're starting to introduce range extenders, I think, as their markets go outside of the big cities into use cases where charging is maybe not as easy. So what strategies are you seeing by car manufacturers around the world looking at these different choices and options?
Well, we've been talking to a lot of OEMs recently. I mean, FEV, we are development partners for virtually all large OEs anyway, and then also doing some strategic work for them. It's really interesting to see that basically all of the legacy OEMs are at least looking into if they need to introduce a REEV. Many of them already have traditional plug-in hybrids, so in some cases, the direction might be okay if I simply further improve my traditional plug-in hybrids, also improve the efficiency in e-drive there, further increase the ranges of those, whether that is enough, so to speak. And the question we get asked a lot is, looking into Europe particularly, there might be high relevance in the market in the second half of the 2020s. But what's after that? So if they start developing it now, introduce it in the market by the end of the decade, will it have a relevance, and not just for a few years, but for a longer term? So this is the key question right now. Obviously, in the US and China, the longer term relevance of such powertrain architectures, REEV architectures, is more certain, and therefore we see also the focus on those markets when it comes to these decisions. At the same time, we were talking already about the attractiveness of REEVs from a customer perspective, and I 100% agree. And by the way, one element which we did not touch upon is that if an end customer drives a REEV, you can really feel that this is efficient and it's a very nice driving experience, really a BEV-like driving experience, responsive, smooth. and efficient, whereas the e-drive in traditional plug-in hybrids was very inefficient and therefore the lower ranges. So with uncertain boundary conditions, EVs going up and down, fluctuating a lot, having a vehicle concept that can be produced on the same production lines as battery electric vehicles makes the overall robustness of the portfolio and the resilience of the portfolio higher. And that's also a big aspect, not just the customer side of things, why REEVs are being hyped right now or heavily looked into, but also the resilience of legacy OEMs portfolios.
I'll just add one thing there, which is that there's a sort of size element of the vehicle as well. So if your portfolio of models as an OEM is a lot of smaller, lighter weight models, then full electrification, it looks pretty likely. Maybe the timeline is different. Maybe it's 2030, 2035. It varies. But where it's a little more uncertain is around some of the heavier vehicles. And that's part of the reason why you see the North American automakers, Ford, making very positive noises about EREVs, is that once a vehicle gets to a certain size, it's very hard to cost effectively go full electric with high performance and high range. So when you look at, say the Chevy Silverado pickup truck in the US, the highest spec battery electric vehicle there has 200 kilowatt hour battery pack. That's about $20,000 worth of raw material or worth of battery costs going into that. And that's why you see, and so it's going to take a long time before that is at price parity with a conventional pickup truck, which is why you see some of the big pickup truck makers in North America saying, actually, maybe EREVs are a good solution for our heavier vehicles in particular, because those are just going to be very hard to go full electric in the near term. So I think there's this element of, as you said, this kind of optimizing the portfolio and future-proofing the portfolio. And those decisions vary a bit depending on which segments the individual automaker is the strongest in and the weight classes they're in.
I think also there's a sort of transitional technology, isn't there, while infrastructure is being developed. I think if we look at some of those pinch points like Exeter services in August when people are going on holiday, there are going to be queues for vehicle charging points, or the car park at Glastonbury. You're not going to put in lots of chargers at events that happen infrequently, but you could have tens of thousands of people wanting to go there. So having a technology on board the vehicle that allows you to overcome situations where you can't charge is probably beneficial. I think as well, looking at the Chinese market, there's a real push for very high brake thermal efficiency of the range extender engines they're looking at. And we're seeing numbers of sort of 42% or more in terms of brake thermal efficiency. And when you're at that sort of level, actually you're getting almost to CO2 parity with the grid in China at the moment. So again, from a sort of environmental perspective, actually these technologies are progressing in the right direction.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, clearly range extenders has been discussed quite a lot here, and in terms of an emerging technology, and they first sort of came around because of maybe range anxiety for people wanting to move to full EVs, but maybe not quite willing to make that full leap. And we see other developments like Formula One, for example, that's going to be 50-50 ICE powered versus battery powered in 2026. So what do you all see in terms of the technology developments in the next few years for hybrid vehicles in kind of the midterm?
If I may start, what we see is, interestingly, you really need to look at it region by region. So I think right now, what's already happening in China is, and has happened, is that the e-motor power to ICE power is far higher than 50-50. So on those REEVs, you typically have 200, even 300 kilowatts of electric power combined with anywhere between 60 and 110 kilowatts ICE. So a significantly stronger e-motor compared to the ICE, which makes sense in such kind of an arrangement. If you were to transfer such a REEV concept and optimize it for the US market, for example, and I very much agree with what Colin said, that here the focus is more on larger vehicles. And if you look into those use cases, you still would want to have those very powerful e-motors. So 200 kilowatts plus, sometimes even 300-400 kilowatts, no problem. But you need a slightly larger ICE because there the use cases let's say if the battery is depleted at some point, you are towing a trailer and still want a good enough performance going uphill sometimes and so on. So here we see very strong e-motors, but an increased power of the ICE.
I'll make one sort of midterm, I guess it's a prediction. I think we'll see at least one or two automakers just say default hybrid across the board, and then everything else up from there. So hybrid technology is, for full hybrids, we're not talking about EREVs or plug-in hybrids here, is a very mature technology. The additional cost on the vehicle is not that high. And to be honest, I think as you try and balance more and more of these fuel economy regulations in different parts of the world, it becomes a simplifying element of the portfolio to say there's a minimum level of electrification across everything. And then some of them have higher levels of electrification depending on the market. And I think that's important because I think it's the right thing to do from a consumer demand point of view and also from an environmental point of view. It also helps with the credibility. You have groups like Toyota for a long time who said that hybrids are going to be a big part of the mix, but it's still very hard to buy a Toyota Tundra hybrid, for example. That would save a significant amount of emissions if the majority of all Toyota Tundra were hybrids. So I think there's something about saying I hope we'll see an automaker say every vehicle will have some level of electrification. Toyota's the closest to that right now, but it would go a long way for their sort of credibility as good actors in attempting to reduce CO2 emissions. If you just said, okay, we won't sell anything that doesn't have some level of that electrification. Mild hybrid is, I would exclude that from that. I hope there's some who say default full hybrid. Of course, it depends on the global portfolio, how easy that is to do. But I think that would go a long way with consumers and also towards meeting environmental regulations. It's kind of remarkable when you think how long we've had the automotive industry that in most of the vehicles sold in the world today, you still can't recuperate the energy from rolling down a hill. That's kind of a failure, if we're honest. There's a huge amount of potential energy in having a big vehicle sitting at the top of a hill, and most of that energy doesn't get captured at all right now. So I fully agree. I think but the tools are all there. Consumers are interested, at least in that level, absolutely. And then in all the other levels beyond that as we said, it varies by country.
Yeah, good point. So look, thanks a lot. Let's come to our final question, and it might be the most difficult. We've strayed into this territory a little bit, but it's about predicting the future. So if you look forward, what are your views, and particularly in reference to hybrid vehicles? Are they a transitional technology? Are they a stepping stone? Or are hybrids in one form or another here to stay and to be part of the vehicle fleets around the world?
I think if you look at it from a global perspective, and the drivers we see and use cases across the different markets, definitely hybrids are there for the longer term. Particularly in China, they make a lot of sense. There is no clear target to go battery electric only, and for all the good reasons we mentioned, there will be quite a big long-term market for REEVs. In the US, since the adoption of BEVs will take quite a bit of time, according to most scenarios at least, there's also room for not only REEVs, but even maybe full hybrids and mild hybrids for quite some time. And then in Europe, obviously it depends a lot on whether or not the CO2 regulation will be changed, adapted in some form. And then, I mean, so far we were talking only about those big three markets, but if you look at the global markets, where the transition towards battery electric vehicles will take even longer, at least in southern regions. And in order to wait for that, or in that transition period, to be as efficient as possible and sustainable as possible, there will be hybrids for quite some time.
Yeah, it's a great point. We haven't talked about India, Southeast Asia, enormous markets, Africa, enormous markets where, the electrification may be challenging because of their infrastructure challenges, and therefore, hybrids could well play a big role there for a very, very long time. Good point.
I think also looking outside the passenger car sector, Colin made the point that as vehicles get bigger, they're much harder to electrify. But you look at heavy duty, long haulage or off highway applications, then I think they'll stay with the ICE for longer periods, possibly fueled by hydrogen, who knows. But I think displacing as much fuel as you can in those sectors with hybridization, it works just as well on a heavy lorry as it does on a passenger car, then why wouldn't you?
I'm not very optimistic on things like fuel cells or e-fuels. Just when you look at the costs of both the fuel and the infrastructure, I think it's a lot. Particularly e-fuels are going to be very, very expensive for a long time. So they would have to be only reserved for a very small part of the market. We've done a lot of cost analysis on those. It looks like you're going to be paying 4 to 5 times the amount you pay for current fuel. So that's going to be a challenge. I think my view on the long term comes down to this technology question. How fast does the technology of batteries move, and how good does it get? And then there's a question of policy. If we work back from climate targets that governments have set, which say we want to go climate CO2 neutral by 2050, you do have to stop selling combustion cars around 2035, maybe a little bit later if you want to force some early retirement. So the track we're on currently has hybrids playing a role out for quite a ways. A track where we really are serious about getting global CO2 emissions under control by 2050. We'll probably see electrification push much further and see hybrids pushed out of the mix much sooner. Whether there's the political will to do that, whether there's the investment needed to do that, that's a different question. But I think it does depend on what we think, how seriously we think governments take some of those climate targets, how much money they want to invest to meet that, and then the underlying speed of the technology. So all of those are in play. None of those are fixed, and we will certainly be surprised by some of the things that happen on that in the years ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, fascinating, and it was a tough question to ask you all to predict the future, but I think you had a pretty good attempt at it because, what you've all said is hybridization is certainly going to be part of the mix going forward. How much and how long will absolutely be influenced by the availability of renewable fuels, legislation, regulation, infrastructure upgrades. All of that's going to play a part. Consumer choice as well. And yeah, some incredible insights from you all today. So thank you very much. I think we could have talked about this for hours and hours, but it was great to get all your insights. So many thanks. Really appreciate you spending the time discussing it. I'm sure we'll carry on talking about it after the cameras stop rolling. But big thank you, and to our online audience, a massive thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Hybrid Horizons content. Take care, everybody.